Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the resolution by the European Parliament to deny China market economy status. Let's get back to our panel. And I'm going to get back to Sitao. A moment ago, Duncan was talking about the fact that the World Trade Organization might declare China a market economy and that Europe would then have to follow. Do you believe that to be the case?
Probably, but at the same time, I think it's in China's best interest to work with Europe, because to achieve some sort of compromise, to take steel industry as an example and some other industries, because China's size, we cannot compare China with other emerging markets. Because the colossal size of various industries, if China is not making money in certain sectors, no country actually would make money in that sector. That's the perfect example of steel industry. Therefore, actually to accelerate consolidation in steel industry is also in China's best interest.
What does China want in Europe? There is already a bilateral treaty, right?
There isn't, but I would certainly agree with what has just been said. What is China's best interest in Europe? There is obviously a move by Chinese companies into Europe in many sectors, not just steel, but also automobile, energy, transport, the running of harbors and ports and airports and highways. So obviously there are many interests at stake, including a political interest. I mean, I'm sitting here from Washington, where of course the mood is quite different when it comes to China. In Europe, there's a sort of a wide range of players, including the European Union institutions and individual countries, and they're all talking to China separately or together in many issues, and perhaps not the issues that annoy China the most, for example, the South China Sea or human rights or Tibet. So in a way, China has developed this relationship with the EU, wants to continue and wants to keep it. And one of the things that it needs to achieve if it wants to continue this sort of long-range and wide relationship with Europe is a bilateral investment treaty. Now, the problem, as I said earlier, is the market access in China has not been as good as it was in a number of sectors. And European companies, as the European Chamber of Commerce has been saying for the past few years, have been complaining about the lack of access. So there's a kind of a discrepancy between the European access and the lack of market access. And therefore, the market economy status, which is of course a technical issue, is somewhat linked to all this. And so a lot of people are saying, well, let's go ahead and finalize this bilateral investment treaty. And then we can move on with other things, including the market economy status and including, a wide range partnership. And by the way, there will be an EU-China summit again in a few weeks. And I suspect, investment will be on top of the list, and market economy status will be as well.
Right, Keyu, talking about investment, Chinese foreign direct investment in the EU is something like, what, $55 billion annually. And we look at some of the other figures there. China has invested in and set up more than 2,000 companies that directly employ 74,000 European workers. Now, wouldn't that suggest that Chinese investment in Europe actually saves jobs?
Yes, I think the danger of using anecdotes such as the steel industry, as just has been said, is that it's not overall representative of the situation. So I think China right now has a lot of capital to export. Among the other things such as steel, also has a lot of capital freely to invest in infrastructure and other wide range of industries in Europe, and it is interested in doing so. Europe's economic woes would be, partly resolved by welcoming more investment where there is not enough domestic savings. So I think all of this are positive things for Europe as a whole, and we need to move beyond just certain kind of traded goods, certain kind of manufacturing industries into overall general investment both ways. And so I think I see huge potential in terms of Chinese investment in Europe in terms of synergies, in terms of opening up the Chinese market, by the way, to the Europeans, there is a lot much more to be done. So in the way, of course, it brings capital. It will also create jobs. It is difficult to say what the net employment related to China is. But we have to understand that in this increasingly globalized world, bilateral trade, bilateral investment, greater global cooperation is ultimately a good thing. And it is very fortunate that advanced economy part of the world, including the US, is turning more protectionist.
Duncan, what about that point that Keyu makes? What about exports from Europe to China?
Well, certainly that is very important in the economic relationship and is becoming more and more important. European exports to China have been growing very rapidly in recent years, although one of the problems for the European Union is that it's a bit wrong to simply take Europe as a whole, because in fact Germany tends to benefit much more from the trading relationship with China than other member states. Last year Germany accounted for over 40% of EU exports to China. But there are important relationships with other member states, and I think that's where it's important to remember that perhaps although the European Parliament voted with a very large majority against granting market economy status to China at the moment, it's not entirely representative of the EU-China economic relationship, and it's certainly not very representative of the opinion more broadly on the EU-China relationship, because there are sectors and industries and member states in the European Union that benefit much more than others from the relationship, and they have a very different view of the relationship. The member states that tend to be more negative about the relationship tend to be the southern European ones, which perhaps for as much for domestic reasons and for reasons within the Eurozone as anything else, tend to be much more or much less competitive in the global economy, and suffer much more from globalization in general than the more competitive economies like Germany, like the Netherlands, Sweden, and to some extent the UK as well. So the opinion within Europe on the relationship with China is actually much more diverse than is reflected by that one single vote in the European Parliament.
If I just may add a point on this, yes, Germany is certainly China's largest European partner and trade partner, and certainly a lot of investment. Not the prime recipient of Chinese investment in Europe, though. But there is also a kind of interesting phenomenon going on in Germany with public opinion that is quite anti-Chinese, really. 28% only of positive opinions for China in Germany, which is by far, the most negative in all of the EU. And people are wondering why. I mean, the other country being Italy, which is a large recipient of Chinese FDI. So China has an image problem in Europe. And whatever happens, I mean, the German government and local MPs or MEPs, for that matter, have to take into account, a diversity of opinions when it comes to China. The Chinese model, nobody doubts that China has done a great job over the past 30 years. The Chinese economy has been a great success, although it's slowing down. But the Europeans as a people don't really recognize China as a model for the future of the world, in terms of societal model as well as economic model. So I think China needs to do a bit more improvement on this, and the economic links will continue. Chinese investments are welcome in Europe and should be welcome. But granting the market economic status is certainly something to be looked at in details, and I think we're going to have to find a compromise there.
Kay, what do you think that?
If I could just add one more thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, if I could add one point, which is that the negative image about China stealing jobs, there's a lot of that going on around the world. But interestingly enough, China has been exporting cheaper products, apparel, sneakers, all these kind of things, cheaper consumer products to the rest of the world and export a certain degree of deflation along with India that never gets talked about. So the Chinese households are subsidizing American households to produce cheaper products for them. So that kind of, talking about image, I think the negative image in a lot of these countries largely hinges upon what the media decides, what kind of message it decides to convey. But funnily enough, we have done in academia a lot of studies on the Chinese impact on consumer products and consumer inflation in many of these countries to have had a significant impact, but none of this kind of message gets across either.
Sitao, is there a compromise in the works here if China is not granted market economy status?
I think a compromise is very much needed. First of all, I think given the size of China, I'm not using any anecdotal evidence. Today, if you look at the market share of Chinese product in developed countries, including Europe, the size is about 15 to 20%. So I think certain protectionism is expected anyway, because the size is too big. Secondly, for certain industries in China, I think a consolidation is long overdue. It's in China's best interest. Thirdly, if we allow foreign competition, open up certain sectors, for example, 10 years ago, perhaps we would not have such excess capacity in certain industries, because in the end, overcapacity is caused by government intervention. So it's necessary for China to do that. But at the same time, we must recognize a fact, due to historical reasons, the role being played by the Chinese government very